My name is Amanda Gilbert. I'm 33, and I live in a modest apartment across town from the house I grew up in. For years, I poured almost every spare dollar I had into paying off one thing, the $420,000 mortgage on my parents' home. I always thought that when the last payment cleared, there would be this moment. Maybe a simple acknowledgement. Maybe my dad saying he understood what I'd sacrificed to keep the house out of foreclosure. Instead, I got a phone call. He didn't even bother with small talk. "I know you cleared the loan," my dad said. "The whole $420,000. But we're gifting the house to Richard." I remember staring at the wall, phone pressed to my ear, thinking I must have misheard him. Before I could say anything, he kept going. "And you're not invited to the celebration. I don't want you bringing your negativity into his moment." My mouth went dry. Richard had drifted through life while I worked overtime to keep that house standing. And now I was the problem. I asked my dad if he was serious. He told me to stop making everything about money. Said family should be happy for each other. Then hung up. I just sat there listening to the dial tone until I finally turned to the only person who knew the truth about those payments and the legal agreement we'd put in place, and asked, "You want to tell them, or should I?" 3 days later, Richard's big celebration didn't look anything like a party. Before I tell you how everything fell apart that day, do me a favor. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Your support helps more people hear what really happens when the responsible child finally stops staying quiet. I learned early that being good at things made me easy to forget. When I was 7 and Richard was 4, I memorized my times tables a year ahead of schedule. My mother glanced at my test paper, said, "That's nice, sweetie," and went back to clapping for Richard because he'd managed to tie his shoes by himself. I remember thinking maybe if I tried harder, did better, they'd look at me the way they looked at him. By middle school, I'd figured out the pattern. I made honor roll every semester. My dad would nod, say something about keeping it up, then turn to Richard to ask about his day. Richard brought home C's and D's, and somehow that became a family project. Tutors. Extra help. Long conversations at the dinner table about his potential. When I asked if I could join the robotics team, my dad said we couldn't afford it. 2 months later, Richard wanted guitar lessons. They bought him a Gibson. High school was more of the same. I worked part-time at a grocery store, saved money, got myself a used car. My parents said they were proud I was so independent. Richard crashed Dad's truck into a mailbox at 16. They bought him a newer car because, and I quote, "boys need reliable transportation." I graduated 3rd in my class. They came to the ceremony but left early because Richard had a baseball game. He was on the bench most of the season. College was when I finally stopped expecting anything to change. I earned a partial scholarship, took out loans for the rest, worked 2 jobs to cover my living expenses. I called home every week. My mother's conversations were always the same. 5 minutes about me, 30 minutes about Richard. How he was adjusting. How hard college was for him. How worried they were. I graduated with honors and a job offer. They missed the ceremony because Richard needed help moving out of his dorm. Richard took 6 years to finish a 4-year degree. When he finally graduated, my parents planned a celebration like he'd cured cancer. I'd been working in my field for 2 years by then, paying down my loans, building a career. But Richard's graduation was the family milestone. The achievement worth celebrating. I used to think maybe it was because he needed more support. That I was capable, so I didn't need the attention. But somewhere along the way, I realized it wasn't about what we needed. It was about what they wanted to see. Richard fit their image of someone who needed them. I was just the one who handled things. The reliable one. The invisible one. So when their financial crisis hit years later, when I found those foreclosure notices stuffed in a drawer, I wasn't surprised they hadn't told me. They probably figured I'd just fix it. And they were right. That's exactly what I did. I found out about the foreclosure by accident. I'd stopped by the house to drop off my mother's birthday present, let myself in with my old key, and saw my dad shoving papers into a drawer in the kitchen. He looked startled, then angry that I'd walked in unannounced. I asked if everything was okay. He said it was fine. Just bills. But the drawer didn't close all the way. After he left the room, I saw the corner of an envelope marked "Final Notice" in red letters. I told myself to leave it alone. It wasn't my business. They were adults. But something in my dad's face had looked desperate, and I couldn't shake it. I opened the drawer. There were dozens of letters. Notices from the mortgage company, the bank, credit card statements with balances that made my stomach drop. Some of the envelopes hadn't even been opened. I spread them across the counter and started organizing by date. The earliest ones were from almost 2 years ago. Missed payments. Late fees. Warnings. The most recent letter was from the county. Foreclosure proceedings had been initiated. They had 90 days. 90 days before my childhood home went to auction. I sat at that kitchen table for an hour, adding numbers, trying to understand how it had gotten this bad. My dad had always been proud of that house. He'd bought it 30 years ago, talked about it like it was his greatest accomplishment. But the numbers told a different story. Refinances. Home equity loans. Credit cards used to cover mortgage payments. They'd been drowning for years and never said a word. My mother came home and found me sitting there with the letters spread out in front of me. She went pale. Started crying. Said they didn't want to burden me. That my dad had been trying to handle it. That Richard didn't know and they didn't want to worry him because he was still figuring out his career. Of course. Protect Richard from the reality. Let Amanda find out by accident. I asked how much they needed. My mother wouldn't look at me. She said it was too much. That they were talking to the bank about options. I asked again. She finally whispered the number. $420,000. The full remaining balance on the mortgage, plus the mountain of debt they'd accumulated trying to keep it afloat. I did the math in my head. My savings. My salary. The promotion I'd just gotten. It would take everything I had and then some. Years of payments. Every extra dollar. My own plans for buying a place, starting something of my own, all of it gone. But it was the house. The place we'd grown up. And despite everything, despite the years of being invisible, they were still my parents. I told my mother I'd handle it. She hugged me, sobbing, saying I was saving them. I just nodded and started making calls. I didn't tell her what it would cost me. She didn't ask. The first payment cleared 3 days after I found those letters. I'd emptied my savings account, taken out a personal loan, and restructured my entire financial life around one goal, keeping that house out of foreclosure. I didn't tell my parents the details. Just that I'd worked it out with the bank. They seemed relieved not to know more. My mother asked once if I was sure I could manage it. I said yes. She said I was a blessing and changed the subject to Richard's new apartment. That was the last time either of them asked. The payments became my second job. Every bonus, every tax return, every dollar I could squeeze from my budget went straight to that mortgage. I canceled the vacation I'd planned. Told my friends I was saving for something big. Stopped going out. Stopped buying anything that wasn't essential. My life shrunk down to work, home, and the transfer I made every month to keep my parents comfortable. I watched my friends buy houses. Get engaged. One of them asked why I was still renting that tiny apartment when I had a good job. I just smiled and said I liked the flexibility. The truth was too complicated. How do you explain that you're bleeding yourself dry for people who barely noticed you existed? A year into the payments, my Uncle Edward called. He was my mother's brother, a retired attorney who'd always been kind to me. He'd heard through family gossip that I'd helped out with my parents' financial situation. He asked me to meet him for coffee. When I told him the full story, his expression went dark. He asked if there was anything in writing. Any agreement acknowledging what I was doing. I said no. My parents knew. That was enough. Edward leaned back in his chair and said the words that changed everything. Amanda, people rewrite history when it's convenient. Especially with money. You need protection. He helped me draft a trust agreement. It was simple but ironclad. The property would be held in trust, with control linked directly to my financial contribution. Any transfer or sale of the house required my explicit consent as the primary beneficiary. My parents would retain the right to live there, but the legal protection was mine. Getting my parents to sign it was easier than I expected. I presented it as a formality, something the bank required for the payment arrangement. My dad barely read it. Just signed where Edward pointed and handed it back. My mother asked if this meant the house was safe. I said yes. She smiled and offered us both coffee. They never asked what the papers actually said. Never questioned why their daughter needed a lawyer present. They just signed away their ability to give away what I was paying for, and didn't even realize it. I left that meeting with the signed documents in my bag and went back to my apartment. Back to my calculations and spreadsheets. Back to watching my life pass by while I funded theirs. 3 more years of payments stretched ahead of me. I'd already given up so much. I didn't know yet how much more it would cost me. The final payment cleared on a Tuesday morning in March. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at the confirmation on my phone. 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. $420,000. Every sacrifice, every missed opportunity, every quiet choice to put their stability before my own future. It was done. I thought about calling my parents but decided to wait. Maybe they'd notice. Maybe they'd call me. I imagined my dad's voice, something simple like, "We saw the mortgage cleared," or "Thank you for what you did." I wasn't expecting a parade. Just acknowledgement. Just something that said they saw me. 3 days passed. Nothing. On Friday, my mother called. My heart jumped. This was it. But she wanted to know if I'd heard from Richard lately. He'd been busy with interviews and she worried he wasn't eating properly. I said I hadn't talked to him. She chatted for another 10 minutes about his job search, then said she had to go. The mortgage never came up. I told myself they were processing it. That maybe they needed time to figure out how to say thank you for something that big. I was making excuses for them, the way I'd done my entire life. The call came the following Wednesday. My dad. No greeting, just "I know you cleared the loan." The whole $420,000. Finally. I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe this was when things would be different. Maybe this was when I stopped being invisible. But we're gifting the house to Richard. The words didn't make sense at first. I actually asked him to repeat himself. He sighed, irritated, like I was being difficult. "We're giving the house to your brother. As a graduation present. He's been working so hard to get his career started, and we want to give him a foundation. A place of his own." I couldn't breathe. 4 years of payments. My savings gone. My life on hold. And they were giving it to Richard like it was theirs to give. I asked if he was joking. My dad's voice went cold. "This is exactly why you're not invited to the celebration. I don't want you bringing your attitude into his big day. Your brother deserves this. My brother deserves this." The words echoed in my head. Richard, who'd never made a single payment. Who'd never asked about the house or how our parents had avoided foreclosure. Who'd probably forgotten they'd ever been in trouble. I tried to speak, to ask how they could do this. My dad cut me off. "Stop making everything about money, Amanda. Family should be happy for each other." Then he hung up. I sat on my couch, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. They hadn't just taken what I'd paid for. They'd erased me completely. Rewritten the story so Richard was the hero's reward and I was the bitter sister who couldn't be happy for him. I looked at my phone. Found Uncle Edward's number. My hands were shaking when I called him. "Uncle Edward," I said when he answered. "Remember that trust agreement? I need you to pull it out." Uncle Edward didn't ask questions over the phone. Just told me to come to his house immediately and bring everything I had related to the mortgage payments. I grabbed the folder I'd kept for 4 years. Bank statements. Payment confirmations. The trust agreement. All of it. When I arrived, he already had his reading glasses on and a legal pad ready. I told him everything. The phone call. The gift to Richard. The party I wasn't invited to. My voice cracked twice, but I made it through. Edward listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every sentence. When I finished, he opened the trust document and read through it slowly. Then he looked up at me. "Amanda, do your parents understand what they signed?" I shook my head. "I don't think they ever really read it." He tapped the paragraph on page 2. "This clause right here states explicitly that any transfer of the property requires your written consent as the primary financial beneficiary. Your father can't give this house to Richard. Legally, he can't give it to anyone. Not without your approval." The words hung in the air. I'd known the trust existed, but I hadn't really understood its power. I'd seen it as protection, insurance against some vague future problem. I hadn't realized it gave me complete control. "They can't do this?" I asked. "They cannot. If they attempt to transfer the deed without your consent, it's void. Unenforceable. And given that you've documented every payment," he gestured to my folder, "there's no ambiguity about your financial contribution. This isn't complicated, Amanda. You own the controlling interest in this property." Something shifted inside me. For 4 years, I'd been the invisible one again. Making payments in the background. Not asking for recognition. Believing that being good and selfless would somehow matter. And they'd taken my silence as permission to erase me completely. Edward called his colleague, Patrick O'Neill, who specialized in property law. We met him that evening at his office. Patrick reviewed everything with the precision of someone who'd seen this story before. Family dynamics. Unequal treatment. Financial exploitation dressed up as duty. "You have an airtight case," Patrick said. "The trust agreement is clear. Your payment history is documented. If they proceed with this transfer, we can halt it immediately and pursue enforcement of the trust terms. The question is, what do you want to happen here?" I thought about my dad's voice on the phone. The casual cruelty of it. The assumption that I'd just accept it. That I'd stay quiet, the way I always had. "I want them to know I'm not invisible anymore," I said. Patrick nodded. "Then we make noise. Loud noise. And we do it before they can muddy the waters or claim ignorance. We establish your legal position publicly and we don't give them room to rewrite the story." I signed the retainer agreement that night. For 4 years, I'd played by their rules. I'd been the good daughter. The responsible one. The one who fixed things quietly. That version of me was done. It was time for them to meet the version who fought back. My parents hosted a family cookout 2 weeks before Richard's celebration. The invitation came through a group text. My mother wrote that they wanted everyone together before Richard's big day. I wasn't specifically uninvited this time, just pointedly reminded that the focus should stay positive. I told Patrick I was going. He advised bringing copies of the trust document but keeping my approach measured. "You're not there to argue," he said. "You're there to establish facts. Let them argue with reality." I arrived late, after most of the extended family had already gathered in the backyard. Aunts, uncles, cousins. My dad was holding court near the grill, telling some story that had everyone laughing. Richard stood next to him, looking comfortable in the spotlight. My mother was bringing out food. Nobody noticed me at first. I grabbed a glass of water and stood near the patio door, watching. My dad's voice carried across the yard. He was talking about the house. About how proud he was to have paid it off after 30 years. How he'd worked hard to give his family stability. How passing it to Richard felt like completing something important. Completing something important. With my money. That I'd bled for. Uncle Edward caught my eye from across the patio. He'd positioned himself near the main table. I walked over and set my bag down. My dad was still talking, gesturing with his spatula, painting himself as the family patriarch who'd single-handedly secured their legacy. I pulled the folder from my bag. Opened it. Placed the trust document on the table where everyone could see it. Then I placed the payment records next to it. 4 years of bank statements. Highlighted. Dated. Undeniable. My cousin Sarah noticed first. She looked at the papers, then at me, confused. My Aunt Margaret leaned over to see what Sarah was looking at. The conversation near the grill started to quiet. "Dad," I said, loud enough to carry. "You're telling that story wrong." He turned, saw me, and his expression tightened. "Amanda. I thought we agreed you'd stay positive today." "I am being positive. I'm positively certain everyone should know the truth about that mortgage you're so proud of paying off." My mother stood up from where she'd been arranging plates. "Amanda, please. Not now." "When, then?" I looked around at the family members who were now watching. "Before or after you give away the house I actually paid for?" The silence was immediate. My dad's face went red. "That's enough." "Is it?" I picked up the trust document. "Because according to this legal agreement you signed 4 years ago, you can't transfer that house without my written consent. And according to these bank records, I'm the one who paid the $420,000 mortgage. Every dollar. While you told everyone it was you." My Aunt Margaret picked up one of the payment statements. Studied it. Looked at my dad. "Kurt, is this true?" My dad's jaw worked. "It's more complicated than she's making it sound." "It's really not," Uncle Edward said quietly. "Amanda saved your house. You signed a trust giving her legal control. Now you're trying to give it to Richard and pretending she doesn't exist." Richard finally spoke up. "Wait, what? Amanda paid off the house?" I looked at him. "You didn't know? They didn't tell you where your graduation present was actually coming from?" The look on his face answered that question. My mother was crying. My dad looked like he wanted to throw me out. But around the yard, family members were passing the documents, reading, whispering. The narrative my father had built, the story he'd been telling, crumbled right there on the patio table. And this time everyone could see exactly what he'd tried to hide. Now, you might think that exposing them in front of the whole family would be enough. But my father had one more move left, and it was going to cost him everything. Stay with me because the next 48 hours changed everything. The cookout ended with my parents asking everyone to leave. My dad wouldn't look at me. My mother kept saying I'd humiliated them in front of the family. Richard sat on the porch steps, staring at his phone like he could disappear into it. I left with Uncle Edward, my copies of the documents back in my bag, and the truth finally out in the open. Patrick called the next morning. "They're proceeding anyway. Your father filed paperwork yesterday to transfer the deed to Richard. He's acting like the trust doesn't exist." Something cold settled in my chest. Even after being exposed, even after everyone knew the truth, my dad was still trying to erase me. Still protecting Richard. Still betting I wouldn't actually fight back. "File everything," I said. Patrick had been ready. Within hours, the legal motions went live. A formal objection to the property transfer citing the trust agreement. An emergency request to freeze any changes to the deed pending resolution. Documentation of my financial contribution and legal standing. Patrick said he'd also sent courtesy copies directly to my parents and Richard, just so there'd be no confusion about what was happening. 2 days later, on the morning of Richard's celebration, the county clerk's office served official notice at my parents' house. All property transfers were suspended due to an active trust dispute. Any attempt to proceed would be void and subject to legal penalties. My mother called me screaming. Said I was destroying Richard's future. That I was being vindictive. That family didn't do this to each other. I asked her which part of stealing my $420,000 sacrifice qualified as family love. She hung up. An hour later, my dad called. His voice was different. Controlled. Almost threatening. He said I was making a mistake. That I'd regret this. That once I went down this path, there was no coming back. I told him I'd made the payments, signed the trust, and had every right to enforce it. He said I was choosing money over family. I almost laughed. No, Dad. You chose Richard over me. I'm just choosing myself for once. He hung up without another word. That afternoon, while my parents were supposed to be setting up for Richard's party, a tow truck arrived at their house. Patrick had done his research. The car Richard drove, the one my parents had bought him 3 years ago, was titled in my father's name. And my father owed $8,000 in personal loans I'd documented, loans that were now in default because he'd been using my mortgage payments to fund Richard's lifestyle instead of paying his own debts. Patrick had contacted the lender. They'd been very interested to learn about the asset. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Sarah. Just a photo. The tow truck pulling away with Richard's car hooked to it. My parents standing in the driveway. And underneath, Sarah had written, "Party's off. Your dad is losing his mind." I looked at the photo for a long moment. 4 years of invisible sacrifice. 4 years of being erased. And now, finally, consequences that couldn't be ignored or rewritten. I texted Patrick, "What's next?" His response came immediately, "Now we take possession of the property." We arrived at the house at 10 o'clock the next morning. Me, Patrick, Uncle Edward, and a locksmith Patrick had hired. My parents' car was in the driveway. Richard's wasn't, obviously. The front door was locked, but I still had my key. I'd never taken it off my keychain. Patrick knocked first. Professional courtesy, he called it. My mother opened the door. Her eyes were red and swollen. When she saw me, something in her expression hardened. "You can't just show up here." "Actually," Patrick said, producing a folder, "Ms. Gilbert has every legal right to be here." "May we come in?" My mother tried to close the door. Patrick put his hand on it, not forcefully, just firmly. "Mrs. Gilbert, we can do this calmly or we can do this with a sheriff's escort. Your choice." She stepped back. We walked into the living room where my dad was sitting on the couch, arms crossed. He looked at me with something close to hatred. "You're really doing this? You really tried to steal what I paid for," I said. "So yes. I'm really doing this." Patrick set his briefcase on the coffee table and pulled out documents. "Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert, I'm Patrick O'Neill, representing your daughter in the enforcement of the property trust established 4 years ago. This is a courtesy notification that as of today, Amanda Gilbert is exercising her rights as primary beneficiary and assuming direct control of this property." My dad stood up. "This is our house." "No sir, it's not." Patrick handed him a document. "Your daughter paid $420,000 to satisfy the mortgage. The trust agreement you signed gives her controlling interest. The county has frozen the attempted transfer to your son. You no longer have the authority to make unilateral decisions about this property." "We live here," my mother said, her voice shaking. "You may continue to reside here," Patrick continued, "subject to terms that Ms. Gilbert will outline. But any sale, transfer, or modification requires her explicit written consent. That's the agreement you signed." My dad threw the papers on the floor. "You can't throw us out of our own home." I'd been quiet until then, letting Patrick handle it. But I stepped forward. You were going to give it to Richard. Were you planning to let him throw you out? Or was the plan always that you'd stay here, in the house I paid for, while he got the credit and the asset? Silence. That's what I thought, I said. I turned to the locksmith. Change every lock. Front door, back door, garage, everything. My mother started crying. Amanda, please. Where are we supposed to go? I don't know, Mom. Where was I supposed to go when you decided I didn't matter? When you erased 4 years of my life like it never happened? My dad's voice was low and vicious. You'll regret this. No, I said. I regret spending 4 years thinking you'd eventually see me. I regret believing family meant something to you beyond what I could provide. This? I gestured around the house. This I don't regret at all. The locksmith started working on the front door. Patrick handed my parents another document. You have 72 hours to arrange alternative housing. Ms. Gilbert will work with you on retrieving your personal belongings. Uncle Edward, who'd been silent near the door, finally spoke. Kurt, Mary. You did this. Own it. We left them sitting in the living room. The sound of the drill changing the locks followed us out to the driveway. I handed Patrick my old key. He'd give me new ones tomorrow. For the first time in 4 years, I felt like I could breathe. My parents moved out 6 weeks later. They found a 2-bedroom apartment across town, the kind of place they could actually afford on their retirement income without someone else paying their mortgage. Richard got his own studio nearby, funded by a job he'd finally committed to now that free housing wasn't an option. None of them spoke to me during the process. Uncle Edward coordinated the retrieval of their belongings. I couldn't watch them pack up rooms I'd grown up in, couldn't stomach my mother's tears or my father's silent rage. I stayed away and let them take what was theirs. Furniture. Photos. Personal items. They cleared out everything except the structure itself, which was all I'd ever really paid for anyway. The house stood empty for 2 weeks after they left. I walked through it alone one Saturday morning, looking at bare walls and clean floors. It felt strange. This place had been the center of so much sacrifice, so much pain. I'd bled myself dry to save it, and for what? So my parents could live comfortably while I stayed invisible? But standing there in the quiet, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't their house anymore. It wasn't a symbol of obligation or a monument to their favoritism. It was just property. An asset. Something I could choose what to do with. Patrick helped me explore options. I could sell it, take the equity I'd earned, and finally start the life I'd postponed. I could rent it out and generate income. I could even live in it myself, though the thought made my chest tight. Too many ghosts. I decided to rent it. A young family with 2 kids, a couple who reminded me of what family could be when it was built on actual partnership instead of exploitation. They loved the house. Loved the neighborhood. The rent covered the property taxes, insurance, and gave me income one could finally use for myself. Richard tried to call once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail saying he hadn't known about the payments, that he was sorry, that he hoped we could talk. I deleted it. His ignorance didn't erase his entitlement or the fact that he'd been willing to accept a house he hadn't earned without asking questions. My mother sent a letter. Pages of guilt and grievance, explaining how hurt they were, how I'd destroyed the family, how they'd only wanted to help Richard get established. She never once acknowledged what I'd actually done or apologized for trying to erase me. I didn't respond. My father never reached out at all. Uncle Edward asked me once if I regretted how it ended. I thought about it. 4 years of payments. A family fractured beyond repair. The permanent distance between me and the people who raised me. No, I said. I regret the 4 years I spent thinking they'd change. I regret believing I had to sacrifice myself to matter to them. But taking the house? Enforcing the trust? Finally choosing myself? That's the only thing I did right. I bought myself a new car with my first rental payment. Nothing extravagant, just something reliable that I picked out for myself. I took the vacation I'd postponed for 4 years. Started saying yes to dinners with friends. Began rebuilding the life I'd put on hold. The house sits on my financial statements now as an asset, not a burden. My name on the deed. My decision what happens to it. And every month when the rent comes in, I'm reminded that I'm not invisible anymore. I never was. I just finally stopped letting them pretend I didn't exist. Thank you for staying with me through this whole journey. If this story helped you feel seen, or gave you courage for your own situation, leave a comment. I read every single one. And subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because you deserve to hear from people who understand what it's like to finally choose yourself.